Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to dive into Scandinavian history and how it's portrayed on screen.
Yeah.
You've given us some really fascinating material to work with for this deep dive, an academic thesis by Karsten Elkjær.
Okay.
And it analyzes two TV miniseries, Gunga Høvdingen, a Danish production from 1992,
Right.
and Snaffenar, which is a Swedish show from 2006.
Okay.
Both shows focus on the Scanian War, that period in the 17th century when the region of Scania was kind of like a prize between Denmark and Sweden.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is how each show uses that conflict to explore ideas about national identity.
Yeah.
You know, who gets to claim Scania?
Right.
Are Scanians Danish, Swedish, or something else entirely?
Yeah.
And these shows grapple with those questions in some really interesting ways.
So before we get into the shows themselves, let's set the stage a little bit.
Okay.
We're talking about the Danish-Swedish Wars, a period that spans centuries with Scania right in the middle.
Right in the middle.
Imagine constant border changes, power struggles,
Yeah.
and the emergence of these local resistance fighters called Snaffenar.
The Snaffenar are a fascinating case study in how history can be interpreted.
Yeah.
You know, to the Swedes, they were rebels, even bandits, using guerrilla tactics to disrupt their control.
Yeah.
But to some Scanians, they were patriots,
Yeah.
fighting for their homeland. And Elkjær's thesis really digs into how each show portrays these figures
Okay.
and what that means for understanding Scanian identity.
That's what I think is so interesting about this deep dive is that we're not just talking about the historical events themselves.
Right.
We're looking at how those events are framed
Exactly.
and retold, which can have a huge impact on how we perceive the past.
Yeah.
So let's start with Snaffenar,
Okay.
the 2006 Swedish miniseries.
Yeah.
This show drops us right into the action in 1678
Okay.
and follows Nils Getting, who is a farmer who becomes a Snaffane leader.
Uh-huh.
And it's got a really gripping, action-packed style.
It really does. The visuals are stunning, the pacing is fast, and it's
Yeah.
full of those edge-of-your-seat moments.
Yeah.
But what's clever is how the show uses that action-adventure format to raise questions about Scanian identity.
Yeah.
You know, Nils' journey from this innocent farmer to this hardened fighter.
Right.
It becomes symbolic of Scania itself,
Okay.
caught in this tug of war between these two powerful nations.
And it's not just about action. There are these really powerful moments of dialogue where the characters are forced to confront
Yes.
what it means to be Scanian. And I remember one scene where Nils says, "I'm not Danish. I am not Swedish. I'm Scanian."
Wow, yeah.
That really stuck with me.
That line gets to the heart of the show's perspective.
Yeah.
It's a rejection of the idea that Scanian identity has to be defined by allegiance to either Denmark or Sweden.
Mm-hmm.
The show seems to be arguing for a distinct Scanian identity rooted in the land, the culture, shared experiences,
Right.
and it challenges this notion of primordialism.
Yeah.
The idea that nations are based on some ancient, unchanging essence.
I'm glad you brought up primordialism because it's one of those academic terms that can feel a bit intimidating.
Yeah.
But it's really important for understanding how national identity is constructed.
Right.
For listeners who might not be familiar with primordialism, think of it like this.
Okay.
Primordialism is the belief that nations are like families. You're born into them,
Uh-huh.
and your identity is fixed.
Yeah.
Snaffenar seems to challenge that idea,
It does.
suggesting that identity is more complex and fluid.
Exactly. And the show reinforces that complexity in how it portrays the other,
Okay.
those outside the Scanian community.
Right.
And initially, it seems like a straightforward us versus them dynamic,
Yeah.
with the Swedes as the enemy.
Right.
But then we're introduced to this incredibly brutal Swedish commander, Lord Leonifud, and he almost becomes a scapegoat,
Okay.
embodying all the violence and cruelty,
Uh-huh.
while King Charles the Elected of Sweden is depicted as much more just even a sympathetic figure.
It's like the show is saying, hey, not all Swedes were bad guys,
Right.
which allows for a more nuanced view of Swedish national identity, too.
Exactly.
It's not about demonizing an entire nation,
Yeah.
but rather highlighting the individual choices and actions that fuel conflict.
And I think that's a really important point to consider.
Yeah.
Snaffenar doesn't let Sweden totally off the hook,
Right.
but it does problematize this simplistic good versus evil narrative.
Okay.
It raises questions about how individual actions can be attributed to entire nations,
Yeah.
and how those narratives are often used to justify conflict.
So now let's jump back in time a bit
Okay.
and look at the 1992 Danish miniseries, Gunga Høvdingen.
Okay.
This one takes place during the First Carl Gustaf War,
Okay.
in 1657.
Mhm.
and centers on Sven Ginge, who is this charismatic Scanian leader fighting on the Danish side.
Okay.
The tone is completely different, much more romanticized and heroic.
Absolutely. It's all about loyalty, bravery.
Yeah.
This idea of Danish national pride, even in the face of potential defeat.
Right.
You get a real sense of celebrating the Danish character, which reflects a particular kind of historical consciousness.
It's like the show is tapping into this deep well of Danish history and mythology.
Yes.
And creating this narrative that reinforces the sense of national unity and strength.
Yeah.
Even though they're facing the serious threat from Sweden, the show really focuses on the resilience and the heroism of the Danish people.
And the portrayal of Sven Gunge himself contributes to that.
Yeah.
He's this larger-than-life figure, almost like a folk hero,
Right.
who embodies all these ideal qualities of a Dane.
Okay.
It's a much more straightforward celebration of Danish national identity
Yeah.
compared to the more nuanced approach we see in Snaffenar.
But what's interesting is that even though it celebrates Danishness,
Right.
Gehøftingen still acknowledges these internal conflicts within Denmark. The show highlights the tension between the common people and the nobility, suggesting that true Danishness is actually rooted in the heart of the common folk, not in the elite classes.
That's a really important observation.
Yeah.
Gungefiving is not just about Danes versus Swedes.
Right.
It's also about different visions of what it means to be Danish.
Okay.
And the show romanticizes peasant life,
Yeah.
portraying them as the backbone of the nation,
Right.
the true bearers of Danish values and traditions.
So even though both shows deal with the same historical period and the same geographical region, they offer very different perspectives on Scanian identity.
They do.
Snaffenar seems to argue for this distinct Scanian identity, while Gungehøvdingen largely subsumes Scanian identity into Danishness.
And that's where Elkshir's analysis gets really interesting.
Yeah.
He argues that these different portrayals reflect not only the different historical contexts in which the shows were made, but also the different ways in which national identity can be understood and constructed.
And it makes me wonder, if someone were to make a show about the Scanian War today, how would they portray these issues?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something that we can delve into further as we continue our deep dive.
Right.
But I think it highlights the fact that these historical narratives are not static.
Right.
They're constantly being reinterpreted and reshaped in light of contemporary concerns and perspectives.
So we've laid the groundwork, explored the historical context, and introduced the two shows.
Yeah.
Now let's dive deeper into Elkshir's analysis.
Okay.
And unpack how each show uses specific storytelling techniques and historical details to create their own unique narratives of Scanian identity.
I'm looking forward to it. There's so much to unpack here.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to see how these seemingly simple entertainment shows can offer such rich insights into this complex world of history, identity, and national narratives.
Yeah.
So, picking up where we left off, I think it's fascinating to look at how Snaffenar uses the term Snaffenar itself. Remember, that was initially like a derogatory term used by the Swedes, basically meaning bandits or outlaws.
Right.
So it's almost unexpected that the show's protagonists would kind of embrace that label.
You're right.
But they do, the characters in the show reclaim Snaffenar as this badge of honor, almost like a symbol of resistance against Swedish rule.
Okay.
It's a clever way for the show to acknowledge the negative connotations while simultaneously flipping the script.
It also plays into that whole David versus Goliath dynamic, right?
It does.
You've got these scrappy Scanian fighters going up against the might of the Swedish Empire, using guerrilla tactics to defend their homeland. It's a story that resonates on multiple levels.
Yes.
It's about Scania, but it also taps into this universal theme of fighting for freedom against overwhelming odds.
And Snaffenar really leans into that action-adventure style to draw viewers in.
Yeah.
You've got fast-paced editing, a dramatic score, those stunning shots of the Scanian landscape.
Right.
It all works together to keep you on the edge of your seat.
But even with all the action, the show doesn't shy away from moments of reflection.
No, it doesn't.
The characters really grapple with the complexities of their situation, questioning, what it truly means to be Scanian.
Yeah.
Do they align with Denmark, Sweden, or forge their own path?
Those moments of reflection are crucial, I think.
Okay.
It would be easy to get swept up in the action and spectacle.
Right.
But Snaffenar forces us to pause and consider the human cost of conflict,
Yeah.
the moral dilemmas, and the search for identity amidst all this chaos.
Switching gears to Gengafibding,
Okay.
we see a completely different approach to storytelling.
Yes.
The show leans heavily into this romanticized view of the past.
Right.
Full of swashbuckling, adventure, grand speeches about loyalty and heroism, and a really strong sense of Danish national pride.
And visually, it reflects that romanticized tone.
Yeah.
You've got these beautiful sweeping shots of the Danish countryside, elaborate costumes, and a real focus on creating a sense of wonder and nostalgia.
Right.
It's almost like stepping into a classic adventure story.
It's interesting how both shows use humor, but in very different ways.
Yeah.
Gengafibding relies more on slapstick and witty banter between the characters,
Right.
adding kind of a lighter touch to the drama.
While Snafinar uses humor more sparingly.
Yeah.
Often to highlight the absurdity of war, or to provide a moment of relief from the tension.
Right.
It's a subtle way to remind us that even in the darkest of times, humanity finds ways to cope and connect.
One thing that struck me about Gengafibdingen is how it uses language to reinforce this idea of a shared Danish identity.
Yes.
There are all these proverbs and sayings that the characters use, which would have resonated with Danish viewers and evoked this sense of shared cultural heritage.
It's a subtle but powerful technique.
Yeah.
By tapping into this collective linguistic memory,
Right.
the show creates a sense of belonging and strengthens the idea of a unified Danish nation.
Right.
It's almost like they're saying, these are the stories, the values, the expressions that bind us together as Danes.
Snafinar does something similar, but with more of a regional focus.
Yeah.
They incorporate Scanian dialect and slang, which would have been familiar to viewers from that region and highlighted the cultural distinctiveness of Scania, even within the context of the larger Swedish nation.
It's a way of saying, we may be part of Sweden now, but we have our own unique identity and heritage.
Right.
It reinforces the idea that Scania is not simply an extension of Denmark or Sweden, but a place with its own distinct culture and history.
So if we take a step back and look at both shows together,
Yeah.
it's clear that they're offering very different answers to the question of what does it mean to be Scanian?
Exactly. Gengafibdingen seems to suggest that Scanian identity is essentially Danish, while Snafinar argues for more independent and distinct Scanian identity.
Right.
And these different perspectives are reflected not only in the stories themselves,
Yeah.
but also in the specific filmmaking choices, the dialogue, the use of humor, even the visual aesthetics.
It's also worth considering the historical context in which these shows were made.
Right.
Gengafibdingen was produced in 1992, right after the end of the Cold War, a time of optimism and perhaps even a bit of nostalgia for simpler times.
Whereas Snafinar was made in 2006,
Right.
in a post-9/11 world that felt much more uncertain and perhaps even a bit cynical.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how these different historical moments seem to be reflected in the tone and style of the shows.
It makes you wonder if those different contexts influence the way the creators approach these complex questions of identity and belonging.
Yeah.
Did the end of the Cold War, with its focus on breaking down walls and building bridges, inspire a more inclusive vision of Scanian identity in Snafinar?
It's certainly an interesting possibility.
Yeah.
And perhaps the post-9/11 world, with its heightened awareness of conflict and division, contributed to the more nuanced and even cynical perspective we see in Snafinar.
And it's not just about the historical events themselves.
Right.
It's about how those events are framed, how they are interpreted, and how they're used to create these compelling stories that resonate with audiences decades later.
That's the power of historical fiction, I think.
Yeah.
It allows us to engage with the past in a way that's both entertaining and thought-provoking.
Right.
It can challenge our assumptions, make us question the narratives we've been told,
Right.
and offer new perspectives on familiar events.
And it reminds us that history is not just this collection of facts and dates.
Yeah.
It's this living, breathing thing that continues to shape our understanding of the world and ourselves.
That's a great point. It's so easy to think of history as something static and settled.
Right.
But these shows demonstrate how fluid and open to interpretation it can be.
Yeah.
The same events can be told and retold in countless ways,
Right.
each revealing new layers of meaning and complexity.
Speaking of complexity, I think it's time to bring in another layer of Elkjær's analysis. He talks about different paradigms of national identity.
Yeah.
Primordialism, modernism, and ethnosymbolism.
Yes. These are essentially different ways of understanding how national identities are formed and maintained.
Right.
And what's fascinating is how both shows, even though they were made decades apart, draw on elements of all three.
Okay. I'll admit, I need a little refresher on these terms.
Okay.
Can you break them down for us?
Of course, primordialism, as we've touched on earlier, is this idea that nations are ancient and unchanging.
Okay.
Based on things like shared ancestry or bloodlines. It's the born-into-it view of national identity.
Okay, that makes sense. What about modernism?
Modernism sees nations as more recent inventions.
Okay.
Created through shared language, culture, and institutions.
Right.
Think of it like this. Nations are built, not just inherited.
So modernism acknowledges the role of human agency in shaping national identity,
Right.
while primordialism views it as more fixed and predetermined.
Exactly. And then we have ethnosymbolism, which argues that nations are built on shared myths, symbols, and historical memories.
Okay.
It's about the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from.
So how do these paradigms play out in Gungahyftingen and Snaffenar?
Well, Gungahyftingen definitely leans towards primordialism with its emphasis on Danish blood and heritage. Sven Gungunge is portrayed as the embodiment of the Danish spirit, almost like a figure from legend.
But it also acknowledges the role of shared experiences, especially the struggle against a common enemy,
Right.
which aligns more with modernism.
Right. The show highlights how the Danish people, both commoners and nobility, come together to defend their nation.
Okay.
Suggesting that shared experiences can contribute to the formation of national identity.
And what about Snaffenar? It explicitly rejects the idea of Scania belonging to either Denmark or Sweden, but it still emphasizes the importance of shared Scanian culture, language, and history.
That's a great example of ethnosymbolism at play.
Okay.
The show highlights Scanian traditions, dialect, and folklore, suggesting that these shared cultural elements are what bind the Scanian people together, even in the absence of a clearly defined nation-state.
It's like these shows are saying that national identity is complicated.
It is.
It's not just one thing.
Right.
It's this tapestry woven from multiple threads, ancestry, shared experiences, cultural symbols, and historical narratives.
And that's a really important takeaway.
Yeah.
Especially in a world where national identity is often used to divide people and fuel conflict.
Right.
By acknowledging the complexity of national identity, we can start to dismantle those simplistic us versus them narratives and build a more nuanced understanding of ourselves and others.
It also reminds us to be critical consumers of historical narratives.
Yes.
Whether it's a TV show, a movie, a book, or even a news article. We need to be aware of the perspectives being presented,
Right.
the biases that might be at play, and the voices that might be missing.
Because every story is told from a particular point of view.
Right.
And by engaging with multiple perspectives, questioning the narratives we're given,
Yeah.
and seeking out alternative interpretations,
Right.
we can gain a richer and more nuanced understanding of the past.
I think that's a perfect place to pause for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, explored the historical context, delved into the two shows, and unpacked some key elements of Elkjer's analysis.
Yeah, and in our next segment, we'll take all of these threads and weave them together, exploring how these shows offer insights that are not only relevant to understanding Scania's past, but also resonate with contemporary issues of identity, belonging, and the power of historical narratives.
Okay, so we've explored Gungahyftingen and Snaffenar and how they portray these really complex ideas about Scanian identity during this crazy period in history.
Yeah.
What really struck me is how their different perspectives, shaped by their production contexts, seem to reflect broader shifts in how we view national identity.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Elkjer argues that Gungahyftingen, with its emphasis on a more fixed and heroic Danish identity, reflects a view of the nation that was more dominant in the past.
Right.
It's a story about belonging, about knowing your place in the world, and about fighting for your people.
It makes me think about how historical narratives often reflect the anxieties and aspirations of the time in which they're created.
Yeah.
You know, the post-Cold War era, with its focus on unity and stability, might have influenced the way Gungahyftingen celebrates a strong, unified Danish identity.
Exactly. And then you have Snaffenar, which comes out in 2006.
Right.
A time marked by global uncertainty, the rise of new anxieties about identity and belonging.
Right.
And the show's portrayal of Scania as caught between these two powerful forces, struggling to define itself, might resonate with audiences who are grappling with similar questions in their own lives.
It's like these shows are holding up a mirror to us, reflecting not just the past, but also our present-day struggles with identity, belonging, and the forces that shape our worldviews.
And what I find particularly thought-provoking is how both shows, despite their differences, ultimately raise questions about the very nature of national identity.
Right.
Is it something fixed and inherited, as Gungehoeftingen might suggest?
Right.
Or is it something more fluid and constructed?
Right.
As we see in Snaffenar?
It makes you wonder if there's even such a thing as a pure national identity.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Maybe it's always evolving,
right.
always being negotiated and redefined.
And that ties back to those paradigms of national identity we discussed earlier.
It does.
Primordialism, with its emphasis on fixed and inherited identities, seems increasingly inadequate in a world where people are constantly on the move, interacting across borders, and redefining their sense of belonging.
It's like the world has become more like Snaffenar, with its complex and shifting identities, than Gungehoeftingen, with its clear-cut lines and fixed allegiances.
And that raises some really important questions for us as viewers.
It does.
And as citizens.
Yeah.
How do we navigate a world where identities are increasingly fluid and contested?
Right.
How do we build bridges across differences without erasing the richness and diversity of those differences?
It's a challenge for sure.
Yeah.
But I think engaging with these historical narratives, questioning the stories we've been told, and considering multiple perspectives can help us navigate these complexities.
Absolutely, because understanding the past isn't just about memorizing dates and battles.
Right.
It's about understanding how those events continue to shape the world we live in today.
That's a great point.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? Well, the next time you watch a historical drama, read a book, or even scroll through social media, think about the narratives that you're encountering.
Ask yourself whose perspective is being presented.
Yeah.
What assumptions are being made about identity and belonging?
Right.
And how might these narratives shape our understanding of the world?
Because history is not just about the past.
Yeah.
It's about the present and the future.
Exactly.
It's about who we are, where we come from, and where we're going.
And by engaging with history thoughtfully and critically, we can become more informed citizens, more compassionate neighbors, and more active participants in shaping a better future.
That's a fantastic note to end on.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Scanian identity.
My pleasure.
National narratives and the power of historical storytelling.
It's been great. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.